Welcome back everybody to our series on the Daedric Princes of Oblivion. So far we've covered Mehrunes Dagon, Sheogorath and his counterpart Jiggalak, Hircine and Sanguine. And today it is the turn of the Mistress of Shadow, the Lady of Luck, the daughter of Twilight, Nocturnal. This patron of the Thieves Guild is shrouded in mystery. This is a prince with many conflicting stories and powers, but as always in the series, we will be looking at her lore in game release order. This is to give some insight as to how the characters of the princes are built up and expanded upon over time, because ESO, as an example, despite being set before the mainline games, still has more preceding lore than any of them, whilst Daggerfall wouldn't have that, and so is more foundational. But enough rambling. Remember to subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content, and let's get started. Once again, we are starting with Daggerfall as our first entry, and I think her presence here leads to possibly my favourite of her Daedric quests. You summon Nocturnal on the 8th of Hearthfire, her summoning day, and she gives you the task of slaying a mage for her. But the mage will make you a counter offer when you get there, and tell you the location of Auriel's bow if you spare him, assuming you don't already have it. If you do, he's supposed to offer you another artifact, but it's a little buggy. But anyway, if you take him up on this, you will find Auriel's bow, but it will be a fake that only works for a limited time, and you will fail the quest. But if you kill him instead, you will be given Nocturnal's skeleton key. Somewhat interestingly, it's actually called the skeleton's key here, as in skeleton apostrophe S, implying that this is actually the property of someone called Skeleton, which likely has no lore significance at all, especially since they changed it in later entries, but, you know, it's worth mentioning, I suppose. Now, usually this is where I would talk about the skeleton key, however, this is going to be far more appropriate when we get to Skyrim. Luckily, it'll be quicker than usual getting there though, because Morrowind has very little Nocturnal in it. The only real information is from the Book of Daedra, which debuts in this game, and all it says is that Nocturnal's sphere is night and darkness, which I don't even particularly agree with, but we'll get to that later. For now, let's move on to Oblivion. This game has a far more basic quest premise than Daggerfall. Go to the shrine, kill some people who stole the skeleton key, and get it back. Easy peasy, job done, no tricky wizards and fake artifacts this time. What Oblivion does do that is important, however, is cement Nocturnal's connection with the Thieves Guild. Armand Kristoff confirms as much when you ask him about her, stating that the Thieves Guild revere her and referring to her as the Saint of Suspicion. He also confirms that the commonly used phrase, shadows hide you, is thieves wishing the blessings of Nocturnal upon one another. But of course, the biggest link to the Thieves Guild in Oblivion is the grey cowl of Nocturnal. So, what is it? Well, with Nocturnal being the patron saint of thieves, there are those who thought that stealing from her would gain her affection, which sometimes it does with the skeleton key, but one of these people was Guildmaster Emmer Deriloth, who, at some point in the early 3rd era, probably, stole the cowl from Nocturnal herself. This did not have the intended effect, however. Nocturnal, in her anger, cursed the cowl so that whoever owned it would be forgotten from history, and would only be known by the cowl. This was how the Grey Fox, the Thieves Guild anonymous leader, was created. Many years later, during the events of the Thieves Guild questline in Oblivion, the curse would be lifted. This was done using an Elder Scroll, showing just how powerful both the Elder Scrolls and indeed the curse itself really are. But moving on now to continue the story of the Thieves Guild and Nocturnal, we have Skyrim. Skyrim once again places Nocturnal front and center in the Thieves Guild, but even more heavily. Here we are introduced to the Nightingales, who basically completely contradict some of what we've just talked about, but we'll get to that. The Nightingales are a trio of individuals, usually picked from high-ranking members of the Thieves Guild, who swear fealty to Nocturnal in exchange for certain powers and abilities. Part of this deal is that they shall continue to serve her after death. Another part of this deal is that they must defend the skeleton key, which is housed in the Twilight Sepulchre. This is where things start to fall apart a little. The Sepulchre and the Nightingales are set up as ancient, but obviously we've seen the key in other places of Tamriel, clearly not being guarded by them there, but more importantly, Carlia, one of the Nightingales we meet, tells us that the skeleton key going missing is what is responsible for the guild's decline, as the key is supposed to sustain a portal to Nocturnal's plane of Oblivion, the Evergloam, which we'll talk about later, and through this portal is supposed to flow the luck that allows thieves to operate so well. The problem with this is, well, let's go back to Oblivion as an example. As we covered, the key was stolen, and yet the Thieves Guild is incredibly prosperous during the events of the game. So why is that? Well, let's finally discuss the key itself. Part of the reason I waited until now to talk about it was all the Nightingale stuff, but another part of it was because on top of the previously established ability to unlock any door and act as an unbreakable lockpick, Skyrim adds that the key can unlock anything at all, things like potential or metaphysical doorways or hidden powers. This potentially makes the key the most powerful object, well, ever, but only potentially. You would still require the knowledge of how to use it to accomplish these things, but it may go away to explaining its strange behavior. We know it's supposed to have the ability to disappear and reappear once it's spent too long with a certain thief. Perhaps it being so strange and metaphysical allows it to be in multiple places at once. Perhaps the key in the Sepulchre is a sort of master key or control key, or something that all the other keys come from. This is pure conjecture, but it would explain things. But back to the Evergloam. This is one of the more interesting planes as it is perpetually twilight and contains both a main plane as well as pocket realms, those being Shade Perilous and the Crow's Wood. But what is really interesting about it is that it is said the plane exists between all realities and can be glimpsed briefly when looking at Shadow. This gives Nocturnal yet another connection to shadow magic, which I haven't mentioned so far, despite it being in a much earlier game, because I have a video all about shadow magic already, which I will hopefully remember to link somewhere. But in short, shadow magic is yet another weird metaphysical power with near unlimited potential that is associated with Nocturnal. These things together all make for a solid argument for Nocturnal to be the most powerful of the princes. But her power is all just a big maybe, which is likely the whole point. Nocturnal, being as related to being sneaky as she is, doesn't strike me as someone who would just show her whole hand. Perhaps the power she has is all an illusion, perhaps it's not. It's impossible to gauge a threat when you have no information on it. Seems like the kind of thing she'd be a fan of. But while Skyrim paints Nocturnal as a distant benefactor with a mysterious agenda, the Elder Scrolls Online takes things in a very different direction. One that pushes her from this enigmatic shadow deity into a sort of reality-ending antagonist. And this all starts back in the 230th year of the Second Era, where Nocturnal teams up with Clevica's Vile Mephala and the sea-slowed Keturah to steal the Heart of Transparent Law, which is the stone from the Crystal Tower, if you know what stones are. It's a whole other thing. Don't worry about it, it's fine. For our intents and purposes, it's just a stone that controls the Crystal Tower, which is a big thing in Somerset that supposedly exists across all realities. Keturah manipulates Right Master Lachesis from the Sigic Order into stealing the heart. Lachesis, realizing too late what's happened, turns to Nocturnal for help, not knowing that this is kinda her whole thing, and she teaches him a spell to hide the heart, and he seals it inside himself before forgetting everything under Keturah's influence. Fast forward around 32 years, and Nocturnal returns to the plot tries to take over the Clockwork City, betrays her allies, imprisons Meridia, who's been trying to stop her, but that isn't very important, corrupts Dawnbreaker, which might be important because she directly changed another prince's artifact, and takes the heart to claim the Crystal Tower. Her goal is to achieve a state of omnipotence across all realities, all worlds, by draining energy from Nirn and spreading her influence across all of these worlds, ultimately unraveling reality, which is a lot, but it does fit her long-standing association with shadow magic and metaphysical boundaries and realms that sort of exist in these in-between spaces. But at the same time, the sudden shift into just sort of generic villainy does feel sort of out of step with her more subtle, mysterious roots. In the end, she's defeated by the Vestige, the Psijic Order, and Meridia's champion, and the heart is returned to the tower. And despite the scale of the story, I'd still say it's the quieter, more elusive version of Nocturnal that feels truer to her character. She's most compelling when she's just out of reach, which, considering she's the Lady of Mystery, is probably sort of the point. But not to stray too far from ESO, it does also give us a quest to retrieve the Shade Sickle. This weapon is supposedly able to separate the living from the shadows, which seems to sort of drain them of their willpower until they're just mindless thralls. Just another little connection to shadow magic and how potentially powerful it all is. The only other artifact that's really important would be the Bow of Shadows, which, well, just makes you invisible, really. That's about it. Divaith Fear called it one of the artifacts of unimaginable significance, though, so that's something. It did kill Prince Ator in the Elder Scrolls Redguard, so it did one sort of significant thing. Anyway, there are a few groups who worship Nocturnal, like the Witchmother Coven and the Nightingales and so on, but by far the most interesting interpretation is the Khajiiti one. I have a video all about Khajiit mythology as it relates to the gods, so you might want to watch that for more clarification, but what we're going to focus on is her relationship with Namira. Namira in Khajiiti mythology is essentially the embodiment of the Great Darkness. Nocturnal, known as Noctra, was born later from the heart of Lorkhaj. This is where things get a little messy with spheres of influence. Nocturnal is said to hold domain over the darkness and be this elder being, one of the Urdra, the oldest and most powerful Daedra, but the Khajiiti myth goes against this. I think an easy way to resolve the whole darkness issue, though, is to view Nocturnal as Shadow instead. It fits her character a lot more, and Shadow is fundamentally different to darkness in the Elder Scrolls anyway, whilst you have Namira's darkness that's this more corrupting void of decay and entropy. Another part of Khajiiti mythos, whilst not outright confirmed, except in some texts it is, but whatever, seems to imply that the skeleton key was actually stolen from Azura. But that doesn't really even matter, considering how many Prince's artifacts are just stuff that they found that barely relate to them anyway. I'm looking at you, Periite. Also, she has a thing for crows. It's kind of like Odin's ravens. I wasn't sure whether it's to include that, but yeah, they do stuff for her. In hindsight, they do live in the crow's wood. This bit isn't scripted. I'm just thinking that I kind of messed that up and I should have put it in there. But hey, it's too late now. Anyway, that's about it for Nocturnal, a being of potential and mystery and contradiction. As always, do let me know what you want to see covered next, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.